Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 3rd of April 2024. JR did the mapping for me earlier on today. Thank you very much to him again. So there's possibly some changes to the mapping since he did it up till now, but I've not seen anything on the socials. But just bear that in mind. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video. Right, going to the front line. A few things to say that I've said a number of times over the course of the last few weeks, and that is that there's no change to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatovo to Crimea. That is quite incredible. There's a little bit to say about this salient at the Torsky Terny, in the Torsky and Terny direction to the west of Crimea. Here, well, in fact, before we go there, I actually just want to pop into Andrew Perpetua's live stream from last night and just show you this graph. And this gives you an understanding of basically what's happening at the moment in the what's been happening over the last week, and then basically since October. So these are loss stats for as far as the statistics that Andrew Perpetua and his team have gathered. The green line at the bottom is APCs, or the bottom here, armoured personnel carriers. Then we have the red line of tanks, the blue line of artillery systems or artillery pieces, and the yellow line of infantry fighting vehicles. So I'd forget the blue, and I think it's slightly more problematic to get visual imagery confirmation of artillery pieces lost anyway, due to counter-battery fire and whatnot. But it's the other three things we want to concentrate on, because that tells us a lot about what's going on the front, right? And we can see that October, there were massive losses of infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, and tanks, right? And what happened in October? They attacked Avdiivka, and that was where we saw the Russians lose an absolute ton of stuff around the Terracon area. If you remember, there were columns of equipment that were absolutely battered, and there was a lot of ridicule for the Russians for the absolute destruction of so much of their stuff. They only eventually took Avdiivka because of the onset of the aviation strikes on the troops, and then the Ukrainians ran out of ammunition. But in terms of what happened at the beginning of the Russian offensive, the Russians just lost an absolute ton of stuff. That's reflected here in the graph. So those were visually confirmed losses, and they were unsustainable losses. So in order to rebuild or take out from existing stockpiles what they're losing, you know, they can work at this rate about here, said Andrew in his live stream. So anything above that rate, particularly of tanks and IFVs, is unsustainable. I don't know about APCs at all. I don't think they're making them so much or even refurbishing them so much. They're just using existing stockpiles, and yeah, they just have a ton of them anyway. But yeah, that's a level that Russia want to be losing stuff at. But as you can see, everything has been above that rate in terms of tanks and IFVs in particular. But yeah, October's a bad month, and then it kind of dipped back down a bit. But the general trajectory for infantry fighting vehicles, his yellow line, has been on the up since then. We talked this morning about what Richard Vereka from War Spotting said, which is in the month of March they lost 262, which was a record month, and the ratio of losses of IFVs to tanks has significantly increased, and you can see that the gap is getting larger there until you get to this point. So March, what has happened from February through to March, you can see that the Russians have just lost massive amounts of equipment. Infantry fighting vehicles particularly are getting absolutely hammered. This is incontrovertible. These are absolutely visually confirmed losses and abandonments and damages and whatnot, and captures. And we have like for like. So this is Andrew Perpetua's team having stats here, comparing over time to the same team, comparing their stats. So everything's the same. It's a fair test, if you like. It just shows that March, the last few weeks, has been worse than it was certainly for infantry fighting vehicles. Tanks are about the same level as the losses at the height of the losses in the beginning of the attacks on Avdiivka, and indeed APC is actually higher. So this is just terribly bad statistics for the Russians. And as for infantry fighting vehicles, it is tremendously bad. This is just really bad month. Anyway, You then start, well, you don't start seeing, this is as a result of seeing all of this footage that is coming out day after day at the moment of the Russian losses being absolutely phenomenal. Today, there is claim that the Russian forces have attempted another mechanized push east of Terny, suffering heavy losses. The formation was funneled down a single road, with Ukrainian forces dropping a massive mixture of well-sighted artillery. So artillery's back on the agenda for the Ukrainians. FPV munition, that's always been well used, and then ATGMs seem to be being used a lot more, like javelins are turning up. So the location of this is here. We'll plug that into my map and see what comes up. We say our map, it's JR's, mine, yours, all of us. So this shows that the Russians have been losing equipment way back from where Suriyat Maps has Russian control. So that's interesting for a start. And it's much more likely that, hey, Andrew Perpetua is more correct here, that they are losing it still within their own control area as a result of, they're pulling stuff up here and losing it as a result of all of those things you just heard about. And indeed, about this footage, someone else says, I wrote that a chap called Dan Spune, I wrote once that Sinkivka was where Russian propaganda fairy tales go to die. This was after 6+ months of false claims that it had been captured. So this is the idea that Sinkivka is a place that the Russians famously keep claiming they have captured, but 6 months after claiming it, they still haven't captured it. And indeed, if you remember, Suriyat Maps had Sinkivka being captured by the Russians and then kind of had to walk it back as it just wasn't true, or at least partly captured. So that's still the situation there. The Russians do not control that town, and it's a bit of a fairy tale. It was then. Well, what the comparison is that the Russians are knocking on the door of Terny and have been for some time. For a month, some Russian Telegram channels have claimed that Russia has reached the outskirts of Terny. So far, it looks like more like Vuhledar, a Vuhledar self-flagellation repeat. In other words, they're just beating themselves up, just sending their vehicles to certain death here. And today appears to be another day. Now, it's not to say they don't make advances. They have been advancing here, but they've also been losing lots of equipment, both here and in the other hotspots on the front line. Novomykhailivka has been incredibly costly for the Russians over the last few days, as has the Avdiivka area too. But of course, as mentioned, they will still eke out the odd bit of territorial gain. In fact, as we come further to the south at Bilohorivka, Suriyat Maps pro-Russian mapper says the situation on the Seversk front, the Russian army has managed to capture a series of positions south of Bilohorivka, just here. South of the Bilohorivka chalk quarry. We'll see if that's on the map that we have. Yes, it is. So JR caught that one in. It doesn't look like there's been any changes since then, so that's good. That is a series of gains for the Russians there, but again, it could be just a couple of vehicles driving up there and then getting hit, and then that's the end of the attack. But that signifies to Suriyat Maps that the Russians control that area. Don't know the details there, so don't quote me on that. But that would be the positive view of things for pro-Ukrainian side, or it could be that Russians are making gains there. Now, that if they are making gains there, that's a little bit of a worry. It's interesting topography around here. They find it very difficult to go across there. This is a very this is a bit of a dip, a dell, or it's a quarry. Yeah, so you've got higher sides on the east and indeed on the west. And if you were to sort of try and get over here, first of all, you have to take all this ground here. Then you have to get over these quarry sides and then down into that flat area, and you'd be absolutely mullered. So it's probably not a good idea. As a result, far more sensible to hit the flanks there to the south. To the north, obviously, you've got to go through Bilohorivka, and that's what they're trying to do at the moment. But yeah, that would be, if I was having anything to do with trying to take Bilohorivka, that's what I would do. And it's what the Russians generally do, which is try and flank everywhere after trying to beat their head against a brick wall time and time again, then they eventually go, oh, should we flank it? Yeah, let's flank it. Whereas, I would have thought that's a horrible place to attack. Let's first of all try and attack around here. Now, that's not to say that it's topographically easy here. This whole area is a challenge with the topography, the physical relief of the area, as it is all the way down here. It's not flat fields like you see down on the southern front line. This is all fairly hilly. There are rivers, ravines, all sorts. So Seversk is fairly difficult. The Russians have made some gains here, just not huge gains really. It's a little bit too challenging. Then as we come to the east of Bakhmut, I think yeah, that's all for that area. We can see that there are some gains here according to Andrew Perpetua, and that is catching up to the claims of Suryat maps and deep state maps to the north of Ivanivska on this high ground. That to me is a big worry. This, as well as Novomikhailivka, worries me. So the Russians taking control of that high ground to the north of Ivanivska means that Ivanivska is going to be not long for the grey zone, which at present is half in the grey zone. I think that you can expect the Russians to continue to move through Ivanivska, but also they are getting to the very edge of Chaziv Yar, and that means that Bodanivka will be under more pressure as well. So this is not good news that all the mappers agree that the Russians have got that control up there, and then also some control in the south to the southern in the southern areas of Ivanivska as well, and all the mappers agree with that. So that is a real challenge there. I think you're beginning to see possibly the beginning of the end. Certainly, well, Ivanivska's certainly on its way to being fully controlled by the Russians, but possibly starting to see Chaziv Yar being inched into, and that might then play into what Greg Terry was saying before when I've spoken to him a number of times, and his reference to the battalion commander in the area saying, yeah, Chaziv Yar will be ceded to the Russians at some point. It's just a matter of when, and then they'll move back to defensive areas by this loop of towns and cities. The problem is you start allowing the Russians more territory here, they'll start being able to hit these with artillery and not just longer distance munitions and missiles and whatnot. So yeah, that is not good news around the Ivanivska area there. Then as we come down to Avdiivka, we can see the Russians have made further gains in a number of places, looking to be crossing the river here near Bedici, which is a challenge for the Ukrainians there. Interesting Ukrainian gains to the north here, and I would suggest that the Russians never had that, and this is exactly what I talk about with Suryat maps. He was the only one to say they took control of this, and I said that's really worrying if they have got control of that, because that's the source of this river, and they can just pop around a corner and come down here and attack the Ukrainians from the north, not having to get equipment across the river. It turns out that it's probably unlikely that they did indeed take that, and now we've seen a rejigging of that area. I doubt that's a Ukrainian counterattack there, but I could be wrong. It's a little bit of speculation for me. And we have claims of the Russians here on the other side of the Derna River near Bedici. That would be a huge challenge. I can't speak to the accuracy of that, and that is a Suryat Maps claim again. And then we have what's going on down here between the two water features between Pervomaisky right in the south and the sort of Tonyenka area. So let's zoom out a little bit to give you an idea of where we are. So there's the old Avdiivka salient. That's all been filled in now, and the Russians are taking the land up to this Derna River as it comes to the west there. That's to be expected. And then as they're moving along Pervomaisky, they'll probably try and fill all of this in. Quite how far they'll go and where the Ukrainians have got their defensive lines here, I guess we'll see. But both Deep State Map and Suryat Maps agree that the Russians have made some gains there to the northwest of Pervomaisky. Now we look at what some of the other sources are saying of this area. It's interesting that there's some footage here of Ukrainian soldiers getting off a Marder. It's only very small, it's just one vehicle and some soldiers, but storming the positions of a position of the Russians in the Avdiivka direction. Now, I can't talk to where exactly that is. There's no geolocation that I'm aware of. But it's just quite interesting that the Ukrainians aren't just sitting back and soaking up the pressure, that it is in some places an active defense, and they are willing to strike out and retake or take Russian positions away from them. So, yeah, good to see that. Surrey Maps then, here talking about all that area. Let's see what they say about that northern place near Bedici. So, Russian army took control over part of the southern shore of Derna River, northwest of Tonyenka, reaching positions less than 1 kilometer from Umanska, so that's here. Moreover, Russian troops are clearing the last houses of Orlivka in the opposite side of the river. The situation in Bedici is contradictory. What could be confirmed was that Russian troops were able to establish themselves on the other side of the river. However, they do not yet seem to have reached the western end of the town. On the other hand, it could be confirmed that Russian forces failed in their attempt to consolidate north of the village. So that is to say that in Bedici, they are successfully clearing some areas just here, but they failed to consolidate here, which is kind of Greek for they never really controlled that area. And he was overzealous with his mapping there. And that's what you get. It's not to say, like here, we're quite, as I keep saying, I have to repeat myself, there are newbies. 50% of my viewers are new viewers. So quite often he ends up being correct eventually, but not correct at the time. So it could be that the Russians have got some vehicles here, right? The Ukrainians then repel the attacks, but then the next day the Russians attack again, and then they attack again, and then over time they do take this. And if they end up taking this, then Surrey Maps goes, yeah, I told you I was right. But actually, at the time of changing the mapping, they didn't have control of that ground. And so actually, it's quite often that he's incorrect at the time, but feels vindicated because later on it does become correct. Anyway, that's just my tuppence that I've told you 100 times already. Okay, moving down to past Novelska, which is one of these areas where I don't think, well, he was definitely wrong when he claimed that. As according to Andrew Perpetua and actual visual evidence, that was incorrect. Is it correct now? I don't know. But he's certainly not walked it back, and that generally means that there's no hard evidence that he's seen that's shown that it's correct, although Andrew Perpetua did have our hard evidence at the time that was incorrect. Anyway, moving on down, we're coming to Krasnohorivka, which, interestingly, no changes here. There hasn't been a change here for quite a long time, particularly to the south. I think there's a few changes around here, but to the south of Krasnohorivka, it has been really stabilized, which is good news, and it's been stabilized around Herorivka to the west of or northwest of Mariinka. So that is good news for the Ukrainians. They've also stabilized attacks in Pobieda, which is worrying because here the Russians can move down towards Konstantinivka and also west along in this direction to help take this land as they move towards Kurokova over here, which is almost certainly one of their major objectives. So this, like I've said before, many of these tiny little settlements, agricultural settlements, Pobieda there and Novelska over here, have, considering their size, have quite a lot of importance, and it's good that the Ukrainians have stabilized there. Now, coming a little bit further to the south, minor Ukrainian gains are probably a rejig due to changes to the south, says GIR. We have the Russians making some gains north of Novomykhailivka. Novomykhailivka is an absolute vehicle cemetery by the looks of it. As I said this morning, War Monitor said Ukrainian brigades defending Novomykhailivka, where battles are still ongoing in the month of March, destroyed 32 tanks and 43 armoured vehicles of the Russian forces that were used in the assaults on the town. And that is actually then backed up by just masses of video footage coming out from this area and many others. Another Russian attempt to storm Novomykhailivka, just vehicles getting destroyed here, there, and everywhere. Of the gains that the Russians have made to the north of the small settlement, Surat Map says, situation southwest of Donetsk. During the last 3 days, the Russian army has increased the pressure over the Ukrainians deployed in Novomykhailivka following the advance from the north, where New Forest Belt was taken, and from the south, where troops took full control over the trench system. It's important to note that the advances are taking place along two heights. So we'll look at it here on the sort of normal map. So it's important to note the advances are taking place along the two heights, whose capture will cause a withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the locality and seriously endanger the supply route to Vuhledar and from the south of Konstantinivka. So you've got slightly higher ground over here and slightly higher ground to the south of Novomikhailivka, which itself sits in a kind of low river floodplain. And yeah, the Russians are gaining the advantage both north and south of there. And indeed, if they do take Novomikhailivka, then Paraskevivka's next, and then Konstantinivka, which then gives them control over the highway down to Vuhledar. So it's all about the dominoes here and making sure the first domino doesn't fall, or if it does fall, it's costing the Russians as much as humanly possible and mechanically possible as well, I guess. Right. That's pretty much all there is. There are no changes to the southern front line. I've not looked at the Institute for the Study of War report for yesterday, really. So there's probably more information I could give you. No changes to Krinky either. Just a lot of Russian losses, but with those losses, they do make the territorial gains, and so they may claim success, where others might say that you are taking a leaf out of the book of Pyrrhus, and it's looking like it could end up being a Pyrrhic victory, or at least a victory that costs the Russians dearly. And the question is, will it cost them too much? Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.